Today we'll be discussing the construction of quote unquote in between races, Southern and Eastern European immigrants in the mid 19th century until the early 20th century USA. Race is a social construct without biological foundation. Its power lies in how it has been used to organize societies and assign privilege or oppression. In the United States, both whiteness and blackness were politically constructed. Blackness as a marker of second class citizenship, and whiteness as a gateway to full belonging. This video essay explores how Southern and Eastern European immigrants navigated and eventually gained entry into quote unquote whiteness with its racialized system. Hi, you're in class with Dr. T. During the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, Southern and Eastern Europeans immigrants to the United States were often considered a quote unquote in between race, occupying a position in the racial hierarchy that was neither fully white nor non white. This ambiguous status was shaped by prevailing ideas of racial superiority, which placed Northern and Western Europeans, Anglo-Saxons, Germans, etc., at the top of the hierarchy. Southern Italians, Greeks, Jews, Poles, and others from Eastern Europe were regarded as racially and culturally inferior to these groups, but were still classified legally as white, quote unquote. This racial categorization influenced where these immigrants lived, worked, and how they were treated. In many urban areas, they were forced to live in the same impoverished neighborhoods as African Americans, sharing low-paying jobs and suffering discrimination. The quote-unquote in-between race status meant that they were not fully accepted as white by the dominant society, and as a result experienced systematic exclusion and violence. However, this also meant they were often caught in a delicate social position, facing discrimination from the white establishment, while simultaneously adopting racist attitudes toward Black Americans in an attempt to gain social mobility. Southern and Eastern European immigrants, like African Americans, were relegated to the lowest rungs of the socioeconomic ladder. In cities such as New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia, both groups lived in overcrowded tenements buildings in neighborhoods characterized by poverty, poor sanitation, and crime. They worked in similar sectors, factories, construction sites, and domestic service, where they often endured exploitative labor practices. The labor conditions also exacerbated racial tensions. Employers frequently hired immigrants as strike breakers against unionized Black workers, creating competition for scarce jobs and housing. At the same time, both Black and immigrant workers were often denied access to higher paying jobs reserved for Anglo-Saxon workers. This complicated relationship led to a mixture of solidarity and conflict between African Americans and immigrant communities. One of the starkest examples of discrimination against Southern Europeans occurred in New Orleans in 1891, where 11 Italian immigrants were lynched after being falsely accused of murdering a police chief. Italians in the South, particularly in New Orleans and Mississippi, were often treated similarly to African Americans and were referred to often as white N-words. This dehumanizing treatment illustrates how Italians were racialized in a way that denied them full quote-unquote whiteness. In the early 20th century, Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe faced intense anti-Semitism, which included exclusion from social clubs, universities, and certain professions. In cities like New York, Jewish communities often shared neighborhoods with African Americans in areas such as Harlem. The economic and social discrimination they faced mirrored the experiences of Black Americans, as both groups were relegated to the fringes of society. In cities like Chicago, Polish and Slavic immigrants were seen as racial inferiors by native-born Americans and were often pushed into segregated neighborhoods where they lived alongside African Americans. They were denied access to better housing and jobs, were treated as quote unquote foreign whites. The tensions in these neighborhoods sometimes led to violent clashes, but they also revealed the shared economic hardships faced by both groups. Greek immigrants, particularly in the South, were also seen as racially inferior and often segregated from white communities. Places like Birmingham, Alabama, for example, Greek immigrants were denied access to white labor unions and were forced to live and work in black neighborhoods, performing menial labor. Like Italian, Greeks were frequently called racial slurs and treated as an undesirable community. During and after World War I, suspicion towards Southern and Eastern European immigrants, particularly those from enemy nations, grew. Italians, Poles, and Jews were often accused of being anarchists or communists and were subjugated to surveillance and exclusion from better jobs and housing. This period saw increased discrimination against these groups, even as they sought to assimilate into American society. While many Southern and Eastern European immigrants adopted racist attitudes towards African Americans, in part to be accepted as quote unquote white, there were notable exceptions. These individuals who transcended these prejudices and advocated for civil rights despite opposition from their ethnic communities. Vito Marcantonio was a progressive congressman from East Harlem, New York, representing a district with a large population of Italians, Puerto Ricans, and African Americans. Marcantonio was a staunch advocate for civil rights, supporting anti-lynching legislation and fair employment practices. He worked closely with African American leaders and was deeply committed to racial justice, often at odds with the racist attitudes of his fellow Italian Americans. David Dubazinski, an Eastern European Jewish immigrant, led the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. He was a strong advocate for the inclusion of African American workers in labor organizing and fought against racial discrimination within unions. Dubazinski's Jewish background and experiences with anti-Semitism made him sympathetic to the plight of black workers, even as many Eastern European Jews were resistant to integrating their unions. Fiorello LaGuardia, the son of Italian and Jewish immigrants, became one of New York City's most famous mayors. He appointed African Americans to prominent positions in city government and advocated for desegregation and fair housing policies. LaGuardia's progressive stance on civil rights contrasted with the widespread racial animosity within the Italian American community during his time. Norman Thomas, though not an immigrant himself, was a leading figure in the Socialist Party of America, worked closely with immigrant communities, particularly Eastern European Jews, to build multiracial coalitions. Thomas consistently advocated for civil rights and opposed segregation, seeking to unite working-class Black Americans and European immigrants in a common struggle against economic exploitation. Max Schatterman, an Eastern European Jewish immigrant, was a socialist intellectual and labor organizer who fought for racial equality within the labor movement. Schatterman's advocacy for multiracial unions was controversial among many of his fellow Eastern Europeans, but he remained committed to integrating Black workers into labor organizing, seeing this as essential to economic justice. The concept of the quote-unquote in-between race highlights how Southern and Eastern European immigrants occupied a complex racial position in early 20th century America. While they faced discrimination and were often lumped with African Americans in terms of living conditions and work, many sought to distinguish themselves by adopting racist attitudes. However, figures like Vito Marcantonio David Duzinski and Fiorello LaGuardia showed that solidarity between immigrants and African Americans was possible, advocating for civil rights, even when their ethnic communities were hostile towards Black Americans. This duality reflects the broader tensions within America's racial and immigrant history. Thank you. Please like, please share, please subscribe, and smash that bell